This is BrandScience, the YouTube edition.
Nice work.
Unbelievable!
Fun jam. Hotmark's gone fast.
Get a filter cigarette.
Hi, welcome to BrandScience, Episode 1. This is a brand spanking new podcast that's been in the making for, over a year now. And as I'm sure you can appreciate, making a podcast is a lot of work. Finding the right direction, the right feel, and then pursuing quality guests. It's all encompassing. The most important rule, of course, is speak of something you know. I've been creating media for 30 plus years in broadcast and now social. And I have to admit, I'm as excited today as I was on day one because there's so many opportunities out there with digital and social to express and tell effective and worthwhile stories. In the coming episodes, we'll talk to social media experts, top voice talent, creatives, actors, authors, ad executives, and marketing people, all with an eye on the brand as it relates to real life and creative excellence. And let's face it, after everything that we've all been through over the last 14 months or so, we could all use some distractions. Although the first episode of this podcast is in fact the pandemic, but not this one, the last one, 1918. We'll look at comparisons and parallels and try and make sense of it all. So, without further ado, I'm excited to present our first guest in episode 1, British author Catharine Arnold. All right, with me is renowned author Catharine Arnold. Catharine Arnold is a British author, journalist, and academic, best known for her London series of 5 popular history books, Necropolis, London and Its Debt, Bedlam, London and Its Mad, City of Sin, London and Its Vices, Underworld London, Crime and Punishment in the Capital City, and Globe Life in Shakespeare's London. Catharine Arnold read English at Girton College, Cambridge, and holds a postgraduate degree in psychology. Catharine Arnold is UK Counsel for Psychotherapy and Counseling Writer in Residence. Is that pretty much sum it all up, Catharine?
Yeah, that's great. Yes.
Wonderful. Yes, you have been very busy. I can see that. And you are also the author of Pandemic 1918, the story of the deadliest influenza in history. And Catharine, I am hoping very much that you don't need to change the title of that book.
So do I.
We are all watching what's going on today very carefully and very precariously, because this is obviously a first-time event for all of us. And we are hoping that the world is able to find solutions for this. In any event, Catharine, I was reading your book over the weekend. I very much enjoyed it. The first question I have for you, how are you doing with this current pandemic? You are isolating at home, obviously, and you were just mentioning about family.
Yeah, just one moment there. That's better. I was just turning up the sound and I thought I'd lost you for a sec.
Oh, no.
Well, touch wood so far, not too bad. It's obviously difficult because people say to me, well, you're a writer, you're used to being on your own a lot. And actually, that's very different when it's a choice. When it's a choice to be in this room for hours at a time, but then you can go swimming or you can go to a bar or you can go to a movie, that's fine. It's not so easy if you're having days in solitary imposed upon you. And I think that's what a lot of people have found the most difficult. Even the most introverted and antisocial people I know have found it more difficult than they would expect.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to be a very special kind of person to handle so much isolation. And I think, for putting my kind of psychology hat on, it's the uncertainty people can't deal with. When this country, and the States were going through World War II, we did expect, and we did understand really what we were experiencing. But now it's the terrible uncertainty. It's is it over? Is it finished? Is it coming back? Will it be worse? And it's kind of like, I'd say it's an existential threat, because never before in the history of the world has anybody quite experienced this degree of fear over something new. It's not a familiar enemy like a flu or plague. It's just something that's come at us from out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Very frightening.
And it certainly really hits home when the head of your government comes down with this plague. Now, thankfully, Mr. Johnson came through, but it goes to show you that no one is safe from this, no matter how high or how important. So speculation is that COVID-19, I just want to talk about the origin. COVID-19, again, nobody can say for sure, but many think that this particular pandemic originated from a wet market outside Wuhan, from bats, and the virus jumped over to humans. That's the prevailing story right now. Were they ever able to determine where the Spanish flu originated?
Right. Well, in some ways, it seems like a similar story, although I should say that just this lunchtime with COVID, new stories have been emerging. I say stories in the journalistic sense of the word. New articles have been emerging suggesting that it's some kind of blood-borne disease, and that's why people who suffer from coronavirus are getting blood clots and strokes. So this is a really strange new development, and after this I'm going to try and find out more about it. But before that, it seems the Spanish flu and coronavirus were pretty similar in their origins, because we understand that Spanish flu is basically an avian virus that somehow leapt the species barrier and transmitted to humans. The most popular theory, and the most well-regarded one, the most popular theory is that what we call Spanish flu was a virus that was active in China and was carried to the West by Chinese laborers who'd been hired to help with the Allied war effort. And these laborers went to the States, they went to Europe, they went to Britain first, then out to France. So it's suggested that these guys carried it with them, and it wasn't their fault. There was no evil intention or anything. It's just simply that they were carriers. One thing that gives this theory some credence is the fact that while you would have expected China to have suffered an absolute explosion in mortality rates with Spanish flu, in global terms, deaths in China were not nearly as high as one would have expected, suggesting that there was already a degree of immunity over there. Anyway, back to the origins of Spanish flu. Some people like to claim it for the United States, some people like to claim it for Europe. The competing theories suggest that it either kind of came to prominence at Fort Riley, Camp Funston in Kansas, or it started at a vast army camp on the Western Front in France called Étaples, because very, very similar strains of infection were isolated in both places. The weird thing about pandemics is they don't just start in one place and move on in a systematic fashion, but they seem to spring up almost spontaneously at the same time in different parts of the world, as we saw with coronavirus. So there's still a lot of the etiology to look into there.
Mm-hmm. This kind of fascinates me as well. Why they called it the Spanish flu, and many have looked at this and thought, okay, the obvious assumption is that it originated there, but it did not.
It didn't, no. By the time it got to Spain, this strange unknown killer flu that had started to circulate had already taken out people, it had taken up many soldiers and people in barracks in the United States and in France and Italy. And then it kind of rolled over the Pyrenees and got to Spain, where it infected much of the civilian population, including the King of Spain, Alfonso XIII, who nearly died, and some of his cabinet did actually die. But the strange thing about Spain was that there's no censorship because it was neutral. The King of Spain was related to both royal houses. He was related to Kaiser Wilhelm on one side, Queen Victoria on the other. So he wasn't in the business of taking sides. He wanted Spain to steer clear.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, he survived, but the king's condition allowed doctors and journalists to speculate about this strange new flu. And they could do so freely because there was nobody there to slap a D notice on it or to say, you can't talk about this because it's undermining national morale. This meant that British doctors became intrigued, and they could talk about it, but only in the medical journals here, only in the Lancet and the BMJ. However, that's where it kind of gained its sobriquet. People soon started calling it Spanish flu simply because it started because the flu started in Spain. And the Times of London also started referring to it as Spanish flu in about the June of that year, in usually quite precious articles where it was ridiculed. It was described as a kind of affectation. This is just a fashionable new disease for people to get, and all they needed was a bit of cold weather and it would go away. That just shows that at the time it was not taken seriously.
Right. And I think that's another parallel with our COVID-19, as it doesn't seem to have been taken seriously by many. And,
Absolutely.
And obviously that was a grave mistake. In terms of the spread of the disease, now you talked about the United States. It seems like it was somewhat prominent in North America, and then it sort of wound down, and then it picked up in Europe. It wasn't sort of a international situation like it appears to be today, with the exception of a couple of countries in the Far East. How did it spread back in that time? And I understand that obviously these things, you don't just flip a switch. This flu started before 1918, maybe even as far back as 1916.
Well, there's some evidence to suggest that something like it was already doing the rounds in France in 16 and 17, because a lot of army doctors were out there, and a lot of work as a doctor in those days was very, it seems heartless to suggest, but quite boring and quite repetitive, because you'd normally be dealing with injuries that men had picked up at the front, shrapnel wounds, loss of limbs, being blown up basically by mines, but all fairly predictable. The odd case of gangrene perhaps, and that was it. So in their spare time, here are all these doctors away from their families, sharp, inquiring minds, and they started noticing cases of killer bronchitis developing among the troops. And one of the distinctive things about this killer bronchitis was the very hard pus that was found in the lungs. So the guys are basically drowning in their own fluids.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these symptoms were very similar to the symptoms which developed with Spanish flu. And one or two doctors started writing papers about this, circulating them to the medical journals. And one doctor in particular noticed this in France. And then Adolf Abrahams, who was the brother of Harry Abrahams, the famous runner, picked this up. And he was working in Aldershot. Sorry, forgive me, my brain fog on a Monday. He was working at a barracks in Aldershot, and he said, well, that's really strange because I've done a paper about this too, and a lot of my men have got similar symptoms. So it could have been something that was kind of incubating, but whatever it was, something sparked it off early in 1918. And that's when it took hold like wildfire. And I've already explained that it was sort of happening simultaneously in the army camps in the States. And then, of course, the boys were going home, taking it with them to the civilian population. It was in the prisons, it was in the schools, it was in some of the Native American communities. And we think it probably traveled to France. If it wasn't already in France, it traveled to France from the States, spread there, and of course then, sorry, I've just lost you there.
I'm here?
Yep.
Oh, I'm still here.
Yep, sorry about that.
That's okay.
So it traveled to the States, it traveled to Europe, and it traveled to Britain, of course, and it came home with the servicemen and the nurses, and was very swiftly transmitted by the public transport network. So it would come into the ports in somewhere like Southampton or Glasgow, big city in Scotland, spread through the shipyards, and kind of had a trickle-down effect into the northern industrial areas and the mines. But when I say trickle-down, it's just important to keep in your mind that while we try to imagine flu moving in one movement as a trajectory, we have to think of it as exploding in every direction. So while it's hitting Govan and the Gorbals in the slums of Glasgow, it's also cropping up in Hampshire and killing, among others, Rose Selfridge. I think this is the most terrifying aspect of it, and this is where we can relate to it as a population undergoing coronavirus. It's the random nature of it that's quite frightening.
Yes, of course. Let me ask you, one of the controversial topics today is herd immunity versus waiting for the vaccine to come out. So in 1918, the Spanish flu, it was a vicious flu that, as I read, it's finished off its victims very quickly, often in 48 hours. Did the flu basically play itself out by taking so many lives so quickly? Your book describes how it affected victims with the inability to stand up, being so overwhelmed. And there was a doctor at the time, Dr. Newsholm, who even refused to issue a letter of memorandum to local authorities because he felt that this flu couldn't be stopped.
Yeah, well, yes and no. Going back to Newsholm, he wasn't a doctor. Well, he may have been qualified as a doctor, but I knew him in his role as Sir Arthur Newsholm, and he was effectively head of the civil service. This was before in Britain we didn't have a Home Office as such. We didn't have a Minister for Health. Health was organised as it is in the States on a county by county basis by local authorities. But basically what happened was Walter Fletcher, who was a top Cambridge scientist, who'd been drafted in to study the new flu and to see what could be done about it, realised that it was being transmitted throughout the population by public transport. So he went to Sir Arthur Newsholm and said, can we start quarantining public transport? Can we start limiting the amount of public transport that's taken? Because it seems to me that it's on the buses and the trains and the trams that it's being transmitted the length and breadth of Great Britain. So Sir Arthur Newsholm turned around and suggested that it was highly unpatriotic to stop any kind of public transport, that the workers needed to get to work because the war effort was paramount. And although the phrase had not been invented at that time, he was pretty much saying, keep calm and carry on. His attitude was, there's nothing you can do for flu anyway. It's just flu. It sounds extraordinary to us now. It seems extraordinarily cavalier with the health of the nation. But I guess you have to bear in mind that at that time, killer flu was not unusual. Spanish flu was unusual because of the numbers it took out and the population it attacked. But in those days, it was sadly very common to die of the effects of flu. So on one level, you can kind of understand his attitude. But fortunately, although Sir Arthur Newsholm didn't want to do much about flu, the US Army and the British Army did, because they were worried that we were going to lose the war just because of the sheer numbers of boys who were dying.
The Spanish flu actually did have the Spanish flu did have an impact on the outcome of the war, did it not?
Yes, definitely. General Ludendorff, who is basically the head of the German army, had to cancel the spring offensive in May 1918. That would have been like the big push into France when they really stood a chance of attacking the British army. It brought the war to a halt months before it might have done because they were losing so many men on both sides. In fact, the Germans lost more casualties to Spanish flu than the Allies. But it was definitely one of the engines, if you will, that led to the war finishing sooner than had been expected. Both sides were completely exhausted, their manpower being decimated. There seemed absolutely no point. In any case, the Germans were being starved out, which of course was another factor. One of the things Ludendorff said was, my men are so ill and unfit compared with the British and the Americans, and that's why they succumbed to flu more quickly.
Speaking of which, tell us about the Doughboys, who were fresh off the farm, and why they were particularly vulnerable.
Yeah, the Doughboys, for those who don't know, the Doughboys were the farm boys, basically, the young American soldiers who were transported from the US over to France to fight the Germans. I think it goes back to immunity. Basically, they've been brought up on farms in the middle of nowhere. They've been subjected to very few infections during their childhood, as opposed, say, to a smart kid who'd grown up on the streets of Chicago or New York, who would probably have experienced a number of epidemics during his short lifetime. So it's thought that although these young men were incredibly fit and full of energy and, ready to represent their country, die for their country, they were no match for the flu itself. The other thing was that Spanish flu was almost unique in that it was an autoimmune virus, rather like HIV/AIDS. And so the younger and fitter you were, the more of a fight your body put up against it, and the more likely you were to die. This is a big mystery of it. Why were young, healthy men dying in their thousands, and young women too? And it was basically because the flu was setting off what's called a cytokine storm, where your body is just throwing everything that it's got at the flu, and quite often the effort of that kills you.
It's almost the polar opposite to COVID-19, which I'm not going to say that the young are getting away scot-free, but the Spanish flu really attacked people between 20 and 40 years old. And today it seems the older are more vulnerable to it, and the younger in many cases are asymptomatic and have no idea they've even had or have the flu.
That's correct, yes. And obviously there are exceptions. Our own daughter, one of her colleagues who worked in the same store as her some years ago, died at just the age of 27. But there are factors in that girl's background which may have led to it. But yes, generally people are not more at home with coronavirus, but with coronavirus it is targeting the expected population, that's to say older people, people with pre-existing morbidities, for instance, they're suffering from cancer, or they're extremely obese, or they're diabetic. There have obviously been cases of younger people dying, but that's been the exception rather than the rule.
Right.
There's also kind of a social care angle to what's happening with coronavirus, because whereas in 1980 people tended to live more in large communities and in big families, the pattern now is for our elderly and extremely frail to go into homes where they're cared for by strangers, well-meaning strangers, but paid strangers. And so if you think of some of those carers going to several different homes in the course of a week, then that, I'm sure, is what led to kind of the spiral in care home deaths.
Right. Let's talk about treatments. Back in 1918, opiates, bed rest, and a series of folk remedies were treatments. They didn't have a lot in their arsenal at that time, but something I did read was that there was some experimentation with the treatment of pathogens using blood that contained antibodies from recovered soldiers, similar to what's being talked about today, yes?
I don't know so much about the one with the pathogens, but I do know that they were working very hard to find a vaccine, and at one point they really thought that they developed one. So September 1918, for instance, American scientists felt that a vaccine would be found within weeks, and this led to a kind of sense of false security. So in Philadelphia, for instance, huge bomb marches and victory parades took place in the middle of town, 200,000, 250,000 strong. And there was a moral obligation to attend these things, because if you didn't have a little button saying that you'd bought war bonds, then, you were a pariah, basically, and a burden on the state. And people attended these in vast numbers because they thought, okay, yeah, the flu is around, but it's all right because the vaccine will be available in a few weeks.
And meanwhile,
they put a lot of work into it. But as the historian Alfred Crosby says, one of the difficulties is they didn't really know what they were dealing with. They were just beginning to get towards the idea of a virus. But viruses wouldn't really be isolated as such until the development of the electron microscope in the 1930s.
Mhm.
The first real flu vaccine didn't come in until 1938. And what Crosby says is that it was like looking for a needle in a haystack, but worse than that, it was looking for a needle in a haystack where you didn't know what the haystack looked like, let alone the needle. So there's a lot of well-intentioned work on both sides,
Right.
but nothing conclusive.
What were the sociological impacts of the Spanish flu? And what impact did it have on the women's movement at that time? Of course, nurses received much more prominence because they were so essential in helping get through the epidemic. But what kind of sociological impacts did the Spanish flu have on society at that time?
Right, yeah. Well, that goes back to kind of something that you were asking earlier. Hang on, let me rephrase this. Sorry, I'll need to cut this bit. Let me talk about the sociological impact.
Mhm.
Basically, before 1918 in the States, women of colour were not allowed to become nurses. They were not allowed to train. It was the colour bar, pure and simple. But as the death rate progressed and as the war progressed, the authorities realised that they had to start hiring black women as nurses. One of the long-term benefits of Spanish flu, if there are any, one of the few comforts is the fact that the profession of nursing actually became respected. When Sir Arthur Newsholme said you can't do anything for flu, he was correct in a sense, because there was no medical resource at the time. All you could do was nurse flu patients. And this was what was needed in millions of cases. You needed to be quite often washed down and cleaned up and fed with something like soup, if you could keep it down. You needed to have opium administered, aspirin perhaps, whiskey. You needed above all to be comforted and looked after. And this is of course what nurses could do. This was their great strength. And of course it was a hard, taxing job. They were on their feet sometimes 18 hours a day. In one woman's memoirs, she remembers a linen cupboard at the end of the hospital where everybody used to go and take it in turns to cry because they were simply overwhelmed by nursing so many patients and the lack of resources. The fact that there might be, for every bed, there was a man on the floor waiting for that bed and probably another man behind him.
Oh, my.
Yeah. Excuse me.
Now, on the lighter side, the flu had some interesting nicknames. Can you recall some of them? I did read about, they called it the Naples Soldier. It was based on an operetta song that was, and I quote, was as catchy as the flu. What other names did they attach to the Spanish flu at that time?
Well, we'll go for the Naples Soldier first because that was what the Spanish people called it. The Naples Soldier was a show that was running in Madrid at the time that the king was ill. And so when they started hearing that people were calling it Spanish flu, they're like, we'll blame it on the Italians, basically. In Poland, they blamed it on the Russians. They called it the communist flu. In South Africa, they called it the long pest, which is kind of an Afrikaans word for it. And the Germans had a wonderful phrase for it. They called it the Blitzkatar. And
Wonderful.
the French referred to it with their generic word for flu, which was la grippe.
Ah, yes, yes. Your book also talks about, you actually open your book talking about Sir Mark Sykes, who was a British diplomat who was exhumed in 2007 so they could get a sample of the virus from his corpse to analyze. Can you speak to that? And were there other studies that came from the Spanish flu that actually helped scientists in their search for a modern vaccine, or perhaps even went towards curing non-flu related ailments?
Okay, well, we'll start with Sir Mark Sykes, who is basically a British diplomat, and he was one of the people who signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement over the division of the Middle East, which so many, over a century later, is still causing consternation and tragedy in many cases. But Sir Mark survived the war and went off to the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, which was where various agreements were joined up, including one that said there will be no more wars, and this was the war to end all wars, and like that worked. But basically, while he was over there with a number of other people, including Woodrow Wilson, he contracted Spanish flu. Wilson just about survived, but Sir Mark didn't. So many years later, Professor John Oxford, who is kind of the granddaddy of Spanish flu studies and Spanish flu research, decided that what was needed was to look at the remains of Sir Mark and see if they could find the DNA, which the DNA virus of the flu, which infected him, to see if this would be present in tissue samples. And this was no mean feat. Basically, they had to get permission from the family to dig him up. They had to get permission from the Church of England as well for the exhumation. When the body was when the coffin was brought to the surface, there had to be a priest there, to make sure everything was kind of in full working order in religious terms.
Mm-hmm.
And so they opened the coffin, and all wearing level 5 containment suits, of course, in case he was still actively infected. And they took the tissue samples, but sadly, they were of no use whatsoever, because although Sir Mark had been buried in lead, and therefore his body should have been perfectly preserved and ripe for research, there had been a hole in the coffin over time, and the body had started to disintegrate.
Mm.
So in the end, the experiment didn't pay off. And in fact, Professor John Oxford has looked at other cadavers as well, from the body of a young woman who died in Richmond in London as just a girl, to the bodies of some miners found in Spitsbergen in North Norway. But so far he hasn't managed to find tissue samples which are well preserved enough to get at the DNA.
Mm. And the research that has been done, and it's ironic that they thought they were so close to coming up with a vaccine 100 years ago, and that story sounds very familiar today. I am hoping that we are much more advanced, obviously, and I think there's 10 active vaccines that are being tested right now. So we're much more optimistic today, but it's ironic. Here we are 100 years, we're sending rockets into space, and we still, at this point in time, don't have an actual vaccine for this flu that we're battling. Can you speak to whether there was any research done attached to vaccine research that led into cures for other things? It seems quite often some of the greatest discoveries were made by mistake.
I can't say too much about that. What I would say is that one of the people I've mentioned earlier on, who is Walter Fletcher, who is the Cambridge scientist. He was the guy who had the go at Sir Arthur News Home for not quarantining public transport. He survived, and the rest of his life was dedicated to finding a vaccine for flu and for looking into flu research. And most of this happened in the Mill Hill laboratories in North London, which he helped to found. And off the back of that, of course, we did get the flu vaccine of 1938. But I think it's important to remember that the work continues, that after Spanish flu, it wasn't so much a case of, right, we have to find the flu vaccine now, because by 1920, it seemed to have departed. But there was certainly a consciousness in scientific circles that a flu vaccine was needed. And when so many other vaccines have been developed, why not flu?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting too, because SARS, of course, was much more recent, and they were attempting to find a vaccine for SARS, and it sort of went away. And as soon as SARS was no longer a threat to society, funds and attention were moved into other directions. Society does really seem to be kind of on a emergency basis in terms of how we allocate our money and our resources.
Well, I'm afraid that's the case. And when I was researching this, I had the misguided assumption that we couldn't have a pandemic on any kind of a big scale again, because I was reliably informed by Professor John Oxford, among others. The Home Office in Britain had a contingency and rehearsals were regularly taken so that if pandemic flu threatened this country, the country had the resources to deal with it. It was a higher priority than a terrorist attack, because as we can see, when a pandemic overtakes a country, it's absolutely crippled and everybody suffers, even if they don't get ill.
Mm-hmm.
I was also told there was a similar thing in the States with the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, and that the White House had a pandemic flu plan. I latterly found out that in this country, because of the cuts to the National Health Service, there were far less resources to deal with it. And in fact, that the health service was terrified. The people who ran the health service here were terrified that coronavirus would simply destroy the health service. There would not be enough resources to deal with it. Fortunately, that hasn't happened. But in the States, I found out that the pandemic plan for the White House had been kind of stepped down, and also the plans for Georgia Center for Disease Control had been stepped back on the orders of President Trump.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very much a question of these things come at us, we're not prepared for them, but as soon as they drop off the agenda, then we forget about them, as you say,
Yes.
and we start worrying about the next threat.
Yes. Let's talk about quarantines today versus 1918. So today we have quarantines at home. We're staying in place. We have the internet, so we can somewhat function in many ways in terms of social contact, in terms of work. How did countries handle staying at home, masks, closing down businesses in 1918? How did that function? I'm kind of under the understanding that businesses in the world didn't close down nearly to the extent that we have today. Tell me more about that.
Exactly. It was sporadic, very much so here in Britain and in the United States. For instance, in the States, because as I said, health is run on a state-by-state basis. Some states chose to kind of remain open at all times. Others, and other cities, for instance, Seattle and San Francisco and New York, were much stricter. And the most visible sign of this, of course, was the mask. Not so much in Britain, but certainly in the United States and Canada, the wearing of a mask became a very familiar sight. So, for instance, there are photographs of police directing traffic in Seattle wearing masks. There are whole family gatherings where everybody's wearing a mask, including the cat. There are pictures of not just nurses in masks, as you would expect in a medical context, but factory girls in masks, people in the streets in masks.
Mm-hmm.
And they were very hot on this in San Francisco. And when the third wave came along after the armistice, we're talking December 1918, January 1919, the then mayor of San Francisco said, right, everybody's got to wear a mask. I don't care if it's not legislation, so in a way it's not enforceable, but nobody is going to be allowed out on the streets of San Francisco without a mask. Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
What happened then was that a bunch of people who call themselves the Anti-Mask League decided that this was unconstitutional and they weren't going to take it. So they had a meeting. History does not recall whether this meeting was indoors or outdoors, or whether anybody got infected. But the moderates who turned out for it said, well, this is what we do. We send a petition to the mayor saying, we don't agree with this policy of being told to wear a mask, and that'll do it. But others who were far more vociferous said, no, we need to take direct action. This is wrong. It's unpatriotic. So they wrangled about it for some time, and they sent in a petition saying no more masks. And the mayor's office really did nothing. And then in December 1918, an improvised explosive device turned up at the public health offices.
Oh my.
And it contained an alarm clock to make it go off, about 3 pounds of gunpowder, and various sharp implements. So you can imagine the casualties and possibly the deaths which would have ensued if it had gone off.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, it was carefully detonated. At this point, the mayor of San Francisco says, yeah, okay, about those masks, you don't have to wear them anymore, But let me warn you that if you stop wearing them, the death rate will go up. So the libertarians and the sort of the equivalent of the gobs stopped wearing their masks. And within 10 days, 300 people had died of flu.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So they were kind of the equivalent of what was going on in Michigan a couple of weeks ago.
Yes.
And other
Yes.
parts of the States. Yeah.
Yes. The difference being the head of government in the United States seems to be moving towards opening things up. Time will tell which move will be better for society. Sports and movies and entertainment, everything has come to a crashing halt here. It appears, of course, in 1918 they had the controversial World Series that went on, that was bet on. So obviously baseball was continuing back then. Sports and movie theaters were still open and open for business, and people were sitting in very close confines even throughout this pandemic, correct?
Yes and no. I've seen the pictures of the World Series with the baseball players wearing masks. That's quite extraordinary. One thing that happened was that they were trying to do what we call social distancing by having a seat between each person at the movie theatres. And the Marx Brothers had, it wasn't a movie, it was a theatrical show called Street Cinderella. And I'm just trying to remember which state it was in, but it was a comedy. So basically, you have everybody coming in to see a new Marx Brothers comedy. This is when the boys were just starting out, really, but they'd heard that they were good. Pretty sure it was in Chicago, but I can always check. Mm-hmm. You imagine trying to get an atmosphere as an entertainer or a presenter when people are all sitting kind of dispersed and wearing masks. The show absolutely died on its feet.
Wow.
Less comically, at the beginning of the Spanish flu in Britain in about May 1918, the theatres were all packed full because people at that time didn't realise the danger. They didn't realise that they could become infected so swiftly. Everybody home on leave wanted to go to the theatre, and all their families wanted to go with them. So you've got the case of Robert Graves's mother-in-law, Mabel, and Mabel was desperate to go to the theatre in London's West End with her son, who was back on leave. She dosed herself up, knowing that she was ill, dosed herself up with aspirin, went off to the theatre, and 2 days later she was dead.
Oh my goodness. Does that tie in with the aspirin poison that I read about?
Well, it may do, because that's one of the things I've read about. At the time, people would take anything they thought would get you through it. So if they thought they'd already got it, they would take all the things I've already mentioned, kind of like the traditional remedies. But aspirin was fairly new at the time. And what I suspect happened is people took it in huge quantities in order to bring down their temperatures, and probably ended up giving themselves ulcers and bleeding to death, because of course if you take too much of something like that, it just wears away the wall of your stomach.
Yeah. In talking about the West End and the celebrity life at that time, celebrities obviously were affected by the virus at that time. I was a big fan of the masterpiece series Mr. Selfridge, and I understand Mr. Selfridge's wife, Rose, was one of the victims.
She was. It's such a sad story because she was from Chicago. She was a socialite, but she wasn't one of those kind of women who just lie around the house all day, counting their jewelry. She was always very vigorous and wanted to do things. So when she heard that particularly American officers were getting sick in England and needed looking after, she opened Highcliffe Castle, which is where they were living. I think it's in Dorset, and said, well, come and convalesce here. I will run it as a convalescent home. But sadly, Rose herself got Spanish flu and died. But her husband decided to keep the hospital open anyway, kind of as a memory to her. And she's buried in the local churchyard. But yeah, absolutely tragic.
Yeah. I read that John Steinbeck also had the flu in the United States. And
yes, as
a
teenager.
Yeah, and the cure, or at least the treatment, was quite radical. They would actually open up his lungs.
That's right. No, he was never the same again, quite understandably, because basically they artificially collapsed his lung to help him to recover.
Mhm.
And all this was done with the most basic surgery by the local doctor on the kitchen table.
Oh my
So it's a
goodness.
miracle that he survived at all. But his own description of his near-death experience is amazing, because he says something like, I was passing out, I was becoming very, very ill. I knew it was the Spanish, well, didn't know it was the Spanish flu, but I knew it was the flu. And it seemed as if the tips of angels' wings were passing across my eyes.
Oh my.
And that was such a vivid description. And you know what he means. It's that kind of feeling you get sometimes when you're very, very tired or jet lagged,
Mhm.
but those kind of visual distortions. And the legacy of it stayed with him really for the rest of his life. He was quite a depressed man, quite difficult to live with. I suppose grouchy is the correct medical term, but this didn't stop him, of course, being a great American writer.
Mhm. Mhm. Staying on the celebrity theme, in London, dancer Maude Allen. We're recording this here in Canada, so I'll throw a little bit of Canadian trivia in here. Maude Allen was starring at a show at the London Pavilion. And at the time when all of the flu was going on, she was having a scandalous relationship with Margot Asquith, who was the wife of the former Prime Minister Herbert Asquith. And she sounds like quite a character. Margot was definitely a very ambitious person who did a lot of things. Now, is it true that she was accused of being a spy because she visited a prison of war camp in Germany?
Extraordinary stuff. What you have to bear in mind with the Maude Allen story is the big word allegedly.
Okay.
So Maude Allen appeared in a show called Salome, based on the play by Oscar Wilde about Salome, who demanded the head of John the Baptist. So among other things, Maude was accused of being a lesbian, a drug addict, and even a necrophile. The allegation that she was having an affair with Margot Asquith started because a rumour was going around London at the time that Margot Asquith was a lesbian, even though she was married to Sir Herbert Asquith. Never really got the inside on that, so we never really know whether that was true. But it was alleged that she was having this affair with Maude Allen, who was bravely in those days quite openly gay, lived with another woman. You have then to look at, where does this come from? It comes from a guy called Billings, and Billings is an MP. He's a homophobe, and he claims that the Germans are blackmailing what he calls British perverts. And so Margot was being blackmailed, as were many other people, according to him. He had his own agenda for doing this. He was a crypto-fascist. He was later revealed as anti-Semitic. And he claimed that there was a little black book which had fallen into his hands, which told all about the insider goss and all these celebrities having perverted sex. What's really strange about it is that one of his character witnesses was none other than Oscar Wilde's former boyfriend, Lord Alfred Douglas. So for some reason, Lord Alfred Douglas, one of the most famous gay men of the time, was going into court and speaking up and alleging that Maude was having the affair with Margot. Well, Maude responded by taking out a writ for libel. She accused that Allen's article was libelous, it was defamatory, and some of the language used in it, which I won't repeat for family audiences, was obscene. Unfortunately, Maude lost.
My goodness, that must have made a lot of scandalous headlines at that time.
Yeah.
That's a great story. And just kind of wrapping up here, I also noticed and was fascinated by Dr. Leo Stanley, who, as we talk about sort of controversial characters at the time, and I would say throughout his life, he was the chief surgeon at San Quentin Prison. And he chronicled the onset of the flu on prisoners at San Quentin. That's sort of his tie-in with the pandemic. You mentioned him in your book, and you also, I read about how he later became more famous for a particular area of specialization. In one instance, he offered to purchase the testicles of a person on death row and pay the money to the soon-to-be widow. He wanted a pair of new virile testes that he could implant on older, and I dare say white males to help raise the level of their virility. Can you tell me a bit more about this Dr. Stanley?
He was an extraordinary character. I mean, when it comes to being unethical, he's up there with Dr. Mengele, basically.
Yeah.
Though he may not have killed quite so many people. I mean, to begin, when he was surgeon at San Quentin, obviously it being a prison, Spanish flu ran through there pretty quickly. But instead of thinking, how can I help these men? How can I tackle Spanish flu in an enclosed environment and make these guys comfortable? He saw it as a research opportunity, and he saw his prison as just like one vast Petri dish. It was a man-made experiment, just waiting for him. So he deliberately infected other prisoners. He'd do something like they'd be in a recreation room, listening to the radio or whatever, or perhaps watching a silent movie, and he would make sure that somebody who'd just been admitted from a flu-ravaged area, or he seemed to have the symptoms of flu, would be sitting there with the other uninfected prisoners. At heart, he was a eugenicist. I'd like to say Darwinian, but I think Galtonian is a better example. Mm-hmm. He was a white supremacist, and he believed, of course, that his own kind were superior. When it comes to the experiments with testicles, this bizarre idea developed when he noticed that there's a lot of physical vigor in certain prisoners. But he believed that if you implanted testicles from another man into perhaps an older man, that he would get better and he would get healthier and he would have higher testosterone level. Again, it's bonkers thinking, but you can kind of see where he came from at an era when you couldn't just go and buy synthetic hormones. I mean, now you can just buy testosterone patches or estrogen pills off the internet. He believed he was doing society a favor. He believed that if you took what he called the vigor of the lower races, you could somehow invigorate the white man, because he believed that white male vigor was what was necessary. Quite extraordinary.
Yes.
He also sterilized a lot of people, and believe it or not, sterilization of human beings was legal around 1900 in California.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I just want to say you've been a wonderful guest. I very much appreciate you being with me today. You're currently working on a book for the United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy. You mentioned this.
Yeah.
That's more for the post-grad academic market, I guess.
It is really. I mean, I was asked to do it because I've written about Bedlam Asylum in the past, and I've written about, for the general reader, a book about how mental illness has been treated over the years. That's to say, over the centuries. So I was approached to do something about UKCD, CP, and also to do this book proposal for them. And it's a lot of work. It's highly technical. It's involving a lot of reading and working with psychotherapists, which can sometimes be quite challenging because you always feel like they want to know what you're thinking about it and kind of psychotherapy you. Mm-hmm. But it's an interesting intellectual project.
Wonderful. Well, we'll look forward to that. And in the meantime, thank you again. We've been speaking with Catharine Arnold, author of the London series of 5 popular history books, and Pandemic, 1918, the story of the deadliest influenza in history. You can purchase her book by clicking on the link in our YouTube channel, and it's available online from many of the major online book retailers. Publisher Simon & Schuster. Catharine, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for asking me.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to BrandScience Podcast, the YouTube edition. Remember to subscribe for upcoming episodes, and don't forget to comment below. The comments help us tailor future episodes to topics you'll enjoy. You can learn more about the podcast at brandsciencepodcast.com. Thanks for watching.